When she was 13 years old, Jessyca Mullenberg was residing in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, creative and kind. She loved to write fantastical stories, which she enjoyed sharing with others. But no one in her circle of friends could have ever imagined that her love of sharing stories would be Hercules' heel, which would tear her away from her family. Previously, Jessica's parents, Monica Borgerio and Dale Mullenberg, had gotten a divorce, and her mother had received primary custody of the teen, while her father received weekend visitation. Jessica's father, Dale, eventually settled down in Eau Claire, located in the west central part of Wisconsin. Jessyca would visit him regularly as part of the court-ordered visitation rights and goal of co-parenting that the couple had. The man who had set his mentally ill and unstable sights on Jessyca was Stephen Oliver, a man in his 30s, who had previously worked as an aide at Jessica's school. He previously sexually assaulted Jessyca multiple times, from the time that she was a 3rd grader up into the period of time that she was a 7th grader. Because of her age and easily malleable psyche, Oliver had threatened and scared Jessyca into silence. As many abusers do when given repeat access to their young and impressionable victims, Oliver did not stop when confronted by his victim's mother. In fact, his infatuation was so extreme that investigators later learned Oliver had followed Jessyca as she and her father moved to different cities throughout Wisconsin. He would lavish Jessyca with gifts and would offer her rides in his car. As a result of that, Jessica's mother attempted to get a restraining order against him, as she felt that the gifts and his disproportionate attention towards her was highly inappropriate, but the police said that, without having committed an actual crime against Jessyca, Oliver couldn't be issued a restraining order. In an attempt to be even closer to her, Oliver had moved to Wausau, Wisconsin. But after an unknown, yet threatening interaction with Jessica's mother, Monica, Oliver moved back out of that town. He eventually bought a place across the street from Jessica's father, Dale, and obsessively watched Jessyca from afar. At least at first, as she completed her weekend visitations. It was on one of these weekend visitations, with her father in Eau Claire, that a young and easily manipulated Jessyca was savagely lied to by Oliver when he excitedly told her that an editor from a publishing house in Madison, Wisconsin, was interested in the story she'd written and wanted to discuss the opportunity further with her. Detectives later found out that this was a common ruse Oliver would use to lure his victims in, and his position at an aide at the local elementary school enabled them access to innocent and malleable young minds who would jump at the opportunity for their childish stories to be published professionally. There was no publisher, there never had been. This interaction between Oliver and 13-year-old Jessyca happened on September 16, 1995, and that would be the last day anyone saw her again for more than 3 months. For the next 3 months, 13-year-old Jessyca would be held hostage in a motel room in Houston, Texas, brainwashed through brutal and still somewhat misunderstood methods. Jessyca gave up resisting the constant sexual abuse and waited for a moment when she could finally escape. Jessyca recalls, Oliver promised that he would kill her family if she ever said anything to anyone or made any attempt to escape. She was unable to use the motel's phone because her kidnapper had disconnected it for a portion of the time. Jessyca recalls that she truly believed she was someone else as a result of the steady brainwashing she received at the hands of Oliver, 2 decades her senior. Immediate blitz ensued and was eventually successful. The manager of the motel at which Jessyca was being held saw the national broadcast on America's Most Wanted about the missing teen and recognized the suspect, Stephen Oliver, who had been living in the motel. She managed masquerading as father and daughter for the last 3 months. She promptly called the police. On December 28, 1995, police finally rescued Jessyca from the motel room that she's been held hostage in for over 3 months. During the rescue, Oliver was successfully apprehended. In his trial, Stephen Oliver claimed that he was not guilty of the crimes he was accused of, in fact. He claimed that he was simply trying to help Jessyca get away from her. As he put it, quote, abusive family, and insisted that he was not guilty. In September of 1996, Oliver was found guilty of kidnapping and at the transportation of a minor across state lines for moral purposes. He was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, with the 40-year sentence ending in 2036. Currently, Stephen Oliver is serving his time at a federal correctional facility in Wisconsin. Jessyca has since married and goes by Jessyca Christensen. She has 2 children, a boy and a girl. She graduated with honors from the University of Wisconsin with a bachelor's degree in psychology and now works as a counselor. She has received numerous accolades for her bravery and not only surviving the experience, but also being vocal and open about the ensuing PTSD that many survivors undergo. Jessyca has been an inspiration for many through her public speeches about the abuse and pain that she endured. She travels the state giving speeches at schools and talks about her physical and sexual abuse and hopes that she may assist parents and children in recognizing the red flags of abuse before they continue to develop. In 1996, 12-year-old Sabine Dardenne was cycling to her school when she was kidnapped by Mark Detro and his accomplice Michael Lily Vale in the town of Caen and Belgium. Sabine was then drugged and taken to Detro's house. He chained her to the bed by her neck for the first 2 to 3 days. Later, he moved her to his dungeon cellar, where he built a secret compartment equipped with a mattress and a bulb. During her captivity, Detro repeatedly abused, raped, and kept Sabine half-starved. Detro convinced Sabine that he was her only ally and her savior. He told her that he had rescued her from men who were out to kill her after her parents had failed to pay a ransom. The show also convinced her that her parents knew where she was and that they had abandoned her, even though he attempted to convince her that her parents did not care. Sabine still wrote letters to her mom and dad. Sabine said later that, quote, he said I could write letters. I wrote to my parents. I told them about my day as if I were on holiday. One wished them all the happiness I could. According to him, my parents were mean. I still love them even so. I just wanted to go home. Detro had promised her that he would mail the letters to her parents. However, Detro never did mail the letters. Instead, he read them and used them against her in order to manipulate the 12-year-old. Police later found these letters hidden underneath the carpet. These would help to convict Detro. After Sabine repeatedly complained about boredom and loneliness, Detro kidnapped 14-year-old Letitia Dellens on August 9, 1996. However, this time, his car was spotted by locals, and one of them wrote down his license plate number. Police were soon able to track down his home address. On August 15, 1996, Letitia and Sabine were rescued by police. Due to the concealed nature of the dungeon cellar and the compartment that he had built to hold his young victims hostage, the girls were not found until 2 days after Detro had been arrested. However, Detro's prior kidnapping victims were not as fortunate to be found alive. It would later come to light that Detro was responsible for the deaths of 4 other young girls. In 1995, 8-year-olds Melissa Russo and Julie Lagoon, also kidnapped and sexually abused, died alone After being held hostage in the same dungeon cellar used to house Sabine and Letitia, they died of dehydration and starvation in the same basement while Ditro was in prison for car theft. In a second killing spree in that same year, Ditro buried 17-year-old Anne Marshall and Afel Embro alive. Ditro had an extensive criminal history. In 1989, Ditro, along with his wife, was arrested for kidnapping and raping 5 young girls. Ditro was sentenced to 13 years in prison, but was released on parole after serving only 3 years. In 1995, Detroit was arrested for car theft. This is the time when Melissa and Julie were already being held captive in his house. The police searched his home, but according to them, they didn't find anything suspicious. A locksmith, who accompanied the police officers to the Cho's home, said he'd heard the screams of children coming from inside the house. But the officer in charge dismissed it, saying that it was coming from outside of the home. The locksmith was adamant that the voices were coming from inside the house, to which the officer said, quote, "Who's the police officer here, you or me, the police?" Later said that they did not find the secret passage to the cellar as it was well hidden. Detroit apparently ordered his wife, Michelle Martin, to feed the girls during the time that he was in prison. But Martin did not feed them, later claiming that she was too afraid to go into the basement cellar. 3 months later, Ditro was released from prison. He returned to his home to find Melissa and Julie had been starved to death. Ditro then buried their bodies in the garden of his home. It took 8 years for the case to come to trial. Ditro was sentenced to life in prison, although he briefly escaped. In 1998, his wife, Michelle Martin, was sentenced to 30 years in prison, and his accomplice Michael Lily Vale was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Martin was released 16 years into her sentence. Ditro is currently serving out his life term. His surviving victims have received respect and privacy from the media in order to live out their lives in the most normal capacity possible. Colleen Stan was a 20-year-old woman living with her parents in Eugene, Oregon. On May 19, 1977, Colleen had to go to her friend's birthday party in Northern California. She decided on hitchhiking a ride to her friend's house. She hitched rides from several people and made her way to Red Bluff, California, where she waited for another car to possibly give her a ride all the way to her friend's home. Colleen would later state that she was an experienced hitchhiker and would only accept rides that she deemed were safe. She had already rejected 2 rides before young couple Cameron and Janice Hooker stopped their blue van. Colleen stated that she felt safe getting into their car as the couple was traveling, along with their infant child. A few minutes into the ride, the couple stopped at a gas station, and Colleen got out to use the restroom. She would later recall, quote, "A voice told me to run and jump out a window and never look back, however." As she felt safe with the couple so far along the journey, she decided to return to the car. Upon her return, she saw a makeshift wooden contraption in the car. However, she did not think much of it at the time. Around 30 minutes into the ride, Cameron pulled the car off onto a dirt road and stopped it in an isolated area. Janice got out of the car with the baby. Cameron then immediately pulled a knife and put it to Colleen's throat. He then bound, gagged and blindfolded her, and put the makeshift wooden contraption on her head. The wooden contraption was made with wooden planks and was soundproofed to keep the wearer from seeing or hearing anything. Colleen was then taken back to the couple's home, 30 miles away in Red Bluff, California. Once inside, Cameron stripped Colleen naked, hung her by her arms, and whipped her repeatedly. He then blindfolded her and proceeded to copulate with his wife below her. Reportedly, Cameron had an intense bondage fetish and had used Janice for his bondage outlet. But after the couple married, Cameron introduced the idea of capturing a sex slave who could take the place of Janice. Janice could live with him and have his children. He agreed not to have penetrative sex with the potential sex slave, but with Janice only, although this agreement would later change. Per Janice's agreement, on her first night there, Colleen was forced to sleep in a wooden box that Cameron had constructed. For the next few months, she was kept locked in the box for 23 hours a day and was only taken out for torture. She was beaten, electrocuted, whipped, and burned in January of 1978. Cameron took her aside and told her that he was a member of a powerful, secret organization called, quote, the Company, and if she tried to escape, they would kill her and her family. That same month, Cameron forced her to sign a contract which would enslave her for life. In the contract, Colleen was to be referred to as K. Cameron was to be called Master, and Janice as Ma'am. After the three moved to a mobile home, Cameron began to rape her. She would be kept in a wooden box under the couple's waterbed. In 1978, Janice gave birth to another daughter. Eventually, Colleen was allowed out of the box and allowed to work in the yard, to go for a jog, and to take care of the couple's children. The children never knew that Colleen was a captive. They were told that Colleen would go back to her home every day after babysitting and completing her work. Colleen was only taken out at night for torture after the children were asleep. Colleen never tried to escape, as she feared the company would hunt her down and kill her and her family. She was even allowed to visit her own family in 1981, with Cameron posing as her boyfriend. She was allowed to stay with her family, alone for the night, however. She never told them about her situation due to her fear of the company. Her family believed that she had joined a cult, so they did not pressure her, thinking she would leave and never contact them again. Once back at Cameron's house, fearing Colleen was given too much freedom, he took it all back and started locking her for most of the day. Back in the box, this continued. For the next 3 years, 3 years later, she was given a little more freedom. She was allowed to work as a part-time maid at a nearby motel and even attended church with Janice. Then in 1984, Cameron told Janice that he was planning on marrying Colleen and keeping her as his second wife. He also said that he was planning to bring in more sex slaves. This was the turning point for Janice. She confessed everything to her pastor, who advised her to leave. Janice then went to the motel, where Colleen worked as a maid, and told her that the company did not exist, and that Cameron had made it up. Janice then dropped her off at the bus stop, and before leaving onto the bus, Colleen called Cameron and told him that she was leaving. Cameron reportedly burst into tears. Even though Colleen had escaped after 7 years and was again with her family, she never reported Cameron to the police. Janice had asked Colleen to give Cameron a chance to reform. However, Janice would herself report her husband to the police 3 months later. During his trial, Janice told the judge that Colleen was not the only victim of Cameron's horrible crime. A year prior to Colleen being kidnapped, in January of 1976, Cameron had kidnapped another woman named Marie Elizabeth Spain. Hank Marie was abducted, taken to their home, where he assaulted and later murdered her. However, since her body could not be found, Cameron was never charged for her murder. Cameron was found guilty of multiple counts of kidnapping, using a knife in the kidnapping, rape, and torture. He was sentenced to 104 years in prison. Janice testified against Cameron in exchange for full immunity. In 2015, Cameron was denied parole. Colleen and Janice have both since changed their names and live in various parts of California.